In this tutorial, I'll show you 3 ways how you can apply fancy trims onto your clothes to make them look more special. So here I've got my dress and I'd like to apply a trim onto this waistband to make it look nicer. So here's my waistband pattern. It's actually 2 layers. If you see my sewing, they're sewing onto each other and then the shirt is sewing onto this bottom layer. And I've got 2 separate fabrics, one for the top layer and one for the bottom one. So I'm going to go to the top layer and I'm going to click this icon here to load in a texture. And here you can see is my collection of trims. And it looks rather small, but because it's seamless, it's going to repeat itself for whatever length that I need it to be repeating. So I'm going to say open, and there you can see it's applied. I'll take my transform texture tool and drag it down. You can also scale it or stretch it or distort it. So if you want it narrower, you can make it narrower. Then you can see the texture is narrower. Or if you want it wider, you can stretch it. You can also stretch it to the height. Now it's very dark and I don't want it so dark. And if you saw when I loaded it in first, it actually had some gold on it. But now it looks very dark, and the reason is because I had a red color applied to this fabric before, and now that's blending with my texture and making it even darker. So if you want to see the pure color of your texture without any color over it, just put it to white, and then you can see that golden whitish color. You can also tint a trim or any texture that you load in. So you can see as I'm moving my mouse along, it's changing its hue a bit. Now some trims are going to be harder to tint, especially if they are already a dark color. Then if you want to make a blue trim into a light pink, it's going to be rather difficult unless you desaturate it. So if you wanted to make it a light blue, and it's a very dark trim, darker than this one for instance, you'd go here, texture, desaturation, turn that on, and then you can control the shadow intensity and the bright intensity. And then whatever color that you apply onto it is going to be more visible. But as you see, we lost all the other hues and now it's just one flat color. So I'll turn off desaturation and I'm going to give it a bit of a red tint just so it fits better with my dress. Something like that. And that looks nice. Now since these are 2 layers, we could do some interesting things. We could load in a floral texture, for instance, with a transparent background, and then control what color the background is by changing the color of the underlying waistband. So I'm going to go in here, and I'll load in a floral trim. This one perhaps. Scale it down. And scale it just enough that I don't see those bits of the other flowers that are repeating themselves, and it fits nicely into my waistband. I'm also going to make it a bit more white the color so I can see those flowers. Actually, I'll put it at complete white, pure white. And now you can see whatever color that I make the underlying waistband, it changes here and that becomes a background color. You can even use the color picker to pick a color from the dress in the dark area or the lighter one to choose your background color here. Alright. Now if we were to switch to thick textured surface, sometimes when you look from the bottom, you can see what looks like another of these flowers repeating along the edge, which looks a bit queer. And you'll see that especially if you have some thickness. Like I have here, I have a thickness of 6. And it looks sort of like, almost like there's parts sticking out there that you didn't clean up. But what it is in fact, is this is the side thickness. So if we go onto this fabric that we apply the trim to, and we go to the side, and we turn off use same material as front, and then delete this texture, you can see that was where the texture was, and now we don't see it, we see a white color. Now for this top layer clone, we don't really need so much thickness, but I'm just going to show it to you anyway with the thickness in case you have some waistband which does have thickness and then you want to know how to get rid of those flowers which are appearing around the edges. We can also change the color here to make it blend a bit better. I'll select this color or even the dress's color and make it a touch darker like that. And now we don't see those annoying flowers repeating along the sides. Now I'll show you how to apply trims around edges that are curved, like the open parts of shirts. There are two ways to do that, and I'll show you the first, which is the easiest way, and then I'll show you the second way, which is better for when you export it. And I'll explain that in a moment. So the first way would be to simply press the 2D graphic tool and then load in your trim. So I'm going to load this one in, double click, and then I'm going to click once and say OK to the size that's in here. And there we've got our big trim. Now it's way too big, so I'm going to scale it down from the corner to be the size I want it to be, a bit smaller. Something like that. And I want it to go all around this open part of the shirt. So I'm going to rotate it. Something like that. And then to make it repeat all over here, I'm going to simply Ctrl C to copy it and then Ctrl V to paste it. And then rotate it. Make sure it's meeting up nicely here. And then select this one, copy and paste it. And then rotate it. And this is not a perfect method, it's just the fast and dirty method to get your trims arranged along here. And in my opinion, it's the best method to first see how you like the design before going into Photoshop and actually making one texture that goes all around instead of having all these many little pieces. But if you don't know Photoshop, you can do it this way too. So copy, paste, and transform. And then to make up for that little extra piece there, we could either have stretched our textures, or we can simply copy this one, paste it, and you have to click on the pattern, and then we can take it and just position it that just the edge is on the pattern, closing that off, and the rest is dangling in the air there, it doesn't really matter. And then I'll select all of these pieces, copy, and Ctrl R to reverse paste them, and click. And if it tells you that, just copy it and paste it the regular way, and then right click and say flip horizontally. And there we have it on the other side. Now in this part where there's a gap, I'm going to put a flower. So I'll click my 2D graphic tool. And then I'm going to load in a picture of a flower which I cut out in Photoshop. And then click OK. Come on. And then scale it down. Then I'll zoom up and scale this down a bit further. Now if we move this middle pivot point out of place and then back into place, you can see it turns orange, and then when we scale, it will scale from the center. Now I want to change the color of these trims, so I'm going to select them, make sure that that flower is not selected, and then change the color here to something pinkish. Something like that. So that's one way to add trims when it's not straight but curved. You just copy and paste them around. It's not a perfect method, so let's take a look at another way of doing it. I'm going to click this icon here to hide my textures. I'm going to select all of these, delete them. Then I'm going to zoom out and drag this up where that girl isn't in the way. And now I'm going to go display, and I'll turn off show 2D grid so that it's a clean background. Now to know how big I have to make my Photoshop document, I'm going to do my shortcut Shift L. I think the default one is Shift Z, but you can also right click and say show line length, and then see my line length. Then I'll take my rectangular pattern tool and draw out a box. Something like that. Take my edit pattern tool, and I want it to be like a bounding box that goes tightly around my pattern. So something like that. And then we can see the width and the height that we need to make it. So let's say 372 by 805. So let's head over into Photoshop, and then I'll do File, New, and I'll make the width in millimeters, not in pixels or inches, millimeters, because MD is in millimeters. So that was 372, and the height, what was the height? 805. Okay. And now we've got to make a screenshot of the pattern. I'll delete this rectangular, hide my line lengths, and I'll go here to 2D, so I just see my pattern. And I would go full screen, but my screen capture program is not full screen, so I'll just make a capture of it at this size. Control C, I'm using Snagit, but you can also use the default snipping tool that comes with Windows. The Snagit is really the best tool I find. That's TechSmith Snagit. And then capture. And then I'll save it to my desktop with all my other big mess there. And I'll call this dress snag. And then I'll go into Photoshop and say File, Place. And I'll go to my desktop and find the dress snag. Come on. Place. And it comes in, when you place it, it becomes a smart object, which makes it better for scaling and stuff. So I'm going to hold down Shift and then just scale it up. And because we made this size to fit it, we just need to scale it up until it fits this thing, and then it should be the right size that we need. Maybe even a bit, oops, not there. Hold down Shift to constrain it. And a bit smaller. Something like that. Enter. And now I want to make that trim that runs along here. So I'm going to make a new layer. And I'm going to take my marquee tool, which is this one over here. And I'm just going to make something like this. Then take my paint bucket of any color and just fill that. But make sure it's filling at 100. Then we can deselect, Control D. And then, yeah, first thing we have to do is get the pattern in. So File, Open. And I'm going to use this one with a transparent background. So I'll double click that. Here it is. And then we have to go Edit, Define Pattern. And I'll call this Floral Trim 37. Then we can close that. Double click the layer here, go to Pattern Overlay, and select this trim. And then we can drag on it to position it. Now it's not fitting perfectly in there. I think we have to make the layer a bit bigger. So I'm going to say OK, zoom up using Control and plus, and then Control T to transform it. And let's make it a bit bigger. Something like that, enter. Then go back to our pattern overlay and drag it into position. Now the problem is I want it to be smaller, but it's really big, and if I scale it down here, it becomes mushy. So in fact what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one document that's way longer and then bring that in, copy that in. So let's go File, New. So I'm going to make a new document, File, New. I'm going to make the width 1000 and the height I'm going to make something like 20. Enter. Now it's a very long strip. I'll double click the background, enter, double click this new layer, pattern overlay, select my floral trim again. And it looks like we have to make it a bit taller, so I'll take my crop tool, that was my shortcut C, hotkey C, and then just crop it out a bit. And take my paint bucket and fill this layer. Alright, that looks better. Now the problem is I want to have a transparent background, but here we have a black background. So what do we do about that? Well, whatever color your layer will be, that background color will be showing through, even if your trim is transparent, has a transparent background. So to solve that, we go to Fill, and we take the fill down to 0. If you took the opacity down, it would change the opacity of the whole layer and all the styles, but if you just take the fill down, You still have your style, but you won't have the color.